If we do nothing, large parts of the world will become uninhabitable, and the refugee problem that we see as a problem now will be dwarfed by millions and millions of people moving out of areas that have become so hot that it's impossible to live there without air conditioning. Energy is the major part of the problem, because at present we are dependent on fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, for most of our energy. And these fossil fuels emit greenhouse gases when they're burnt, and that increases the temperature of the earth. It sits as a layer acting like a greenhouse, heating up the earth. So we need to focus on energy, but we also mustn't ignore the other important areas, which are agriculture and forestry, which are also substantial sources of emissions, and they are more difficult to handle than energy. And one important policy would be to put a price on carbon, and that flows through if the price is applied upstream, as we say, at coal mines and oil fields and gas fields, then it flows down through the whole economy, making the use of fossil fuels and the products produced from fossil fuels more expensive. So that is a very important part of a mix, a portfolio of policies that we need. So the carbon dividend, if it ever gets up, would be very valuable, because it basically puts a price on carbon and then returns the money to everyone, every adult, every citizen in the community. So there's no net cost to individuals, although obviously it will put pressure on businesses that use fossil fuels or products produced with fossil fuels, because those fossil fuels and those products will become more expensive. Well, we are now in a situation where we could produce all our electricity in Australia, the United States, Europe, and many other countries and regions from renewable sources of energy, mainly wind and sun, backed up by other sources that are more firm, like hydro and concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage. So in the electricity area, which is the biggest component of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, comes from electricity, which is about 35% of our emissions. Now, then we have to consider other components of energy, heat that is not produced currently from electricity, and transport. With heat, it is fairly straightforward to shift our production of heat in industry from gas, and also in many residential areas from gas. We can shift that to renewable electricity. So that's reasonably straightforward. Transport is a bit tricky. So quite a lot of transport can be electrified. Public transport, trains, buses, of course. Also electric cars are starting to expand the markets, but the two main tricky areas are air and sea transport, because they will need some sort of a fuel produced, a liquid fuel or a gaseous fuel produced by renewable energy. And there's a lot of research and development going on in that area, but that is further behind. The main hope is to produce hydrogen from renewable energy using renewable electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and using hydrogen as a fuel. And also a more convenient fuel to handle is ammonia, that can be produced by combining renewable hydrogen with nitrogen from the atmosphere. So there's a lot of research and development going on in that area, but at present the processes for producing and using hydrogen as a fuel are not very efficient, and that means they're quite expensive. Yes, at present most hydrogen is produced by natural gas, and that produces greenhouse gas emissions. So we must move to producing hydrogen by using renewable energy and having no greenhouse gas emissions in the process. And the large-scale electricity grid, and that system is governed by what's called the national electricity market, at least in the eastern and southern states. poor old Western Australia is left out, it's not connected. And the problem is that the national electricity market was created at a time when the system was much simpler. It had a few large coal-fired power stations feeding power out to main centres of electricity demand. But now what we're seeing is a dramatic change in that system. We're seeing much more distributed sources of energy, and we're seeing citizens generating part of their own power and feeding the rest back into the grid. So now, instead of a one-way system, it's a two-way system, and it's a much more geographically distributed system, and that really requires new rules, new structure to the electricity market. But the incumbents don't really want to see change. So that's another battle that has to be fought if the excellent economics of renewable energy are going to lead to 100% renewable energy. We have to change the market rules and structures to accommodate a different kind of system. Okay, so I'm arguing that the main focus has to be on producing initially renewable electricity, while meanwhile research and development continues on renewable liquid and gaseous fuels. And we're now in a situation that we have essentially all the technologies for producing renewable sources of electricity. Wind power and solar photovoltaic power are cheaper than new fossil fuels. New coal-fired power stations cannot compete. The cost of the renewable system increases a bit if we add on storage to firm up the variable supply from wind and solar, but it's still looking competitive with fossil fuels. Now, although we have this economic advantage, there are roadblocks in the way, barriers that have to be jumped. And one of the barriers is that, strangely, that we're building solar farms and wind farms so quickly, but we don't have enough transmission lines to link them into the main system. And it takes much longer to build a transmission line than it does to build a solar farm or a wind farm. There are approvals for land use and environmental concerns, very justifiable concerns. So we really need to get moving on that, and that's vital. For example, there are many new solar power stations being built in Queensland, producing far more electricity than Queensland can use. But there is only a weak transmission connection between Queensland and New South Wales, and that needs to be upgraded. In New South Wales, in the northern tablelands, we have an area there with a zone with huge renewable energy potential, both wind and solar and pumped hydro. And that could form a fantastic zone to feed power into Sydney and Newcastle and our major cities. But the transmission lines, the transmission link from the northern tablelands to the Hunter Valley is totally inadequate and needs upgrading. So out there is starting to be talk about needing to upgrade transmission lines, but it isn't happening. And I have to add that while a carbon dividend is really important, particularly for increasing the rate at which we can push out coal, it's not really going to help building new infrastructure like transmission lines. The problem is that the policy from the present federal government is almost non-existent. They are very reluctant to see renewable energy grow, and we've seen them holding up a lump of coal in Parliament, one that has been painted over with transparent paint so they don't get their hands dirty. And that is really reached an absurd stage. So, however, in some of the states we're seeing great progress. In Victoria and Queensland, they have very positive policies. They have what we call reverse auctions for large-scale renewable energy, following the lead from the ACT, which started reverse auctions. But we need more action from New South Wales and Western Australia in particular. They don't have renewable energy targets, and they seem to be very reluctant to do more than offer policies which might look good as a kind of veneer, but aren't substantial. Now, fortunately, the state election in New South Wales is coming up, so we're just starting to see some proposed policies from both major parties in New South Wales. If there's a change of federal government, there is an opportunity to really move the transition to sustainable energy on. I would like to see more funding to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which has played a vital role but is underfunded, and it provides finance for new renewable energy projects that are still so early that the banks are often reluctant to lend money on them unless they get some leadership. So I would, and in particular, I think the Clean Energy Finance Corporation should reserve a tranche of funding for what I would call dispatchable renewables. So these are renewable sources that can provide power on demand, like hydro or pumped hydro, like batteries, like concentrated solar thermal power with thermal storage, like gas turbines burning renewable fuels. And these are needed to supplement wind and solar photovoltaics to reduce the variability in a 100% renewable electricity system. It's certainly doable, but the main barriers are no longer technological nor economic, but they are institutional in our existing organisations and rules and other institutions, and they are political. We cannot afford to ignore the need for Australia to do its contribution to the world in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We are a country with one of the highest per capita emissions in the whole world, mainly because of our heavy use of coal, but also we are a big natural gas producer and becoming the major exporter of natural gas. We have leaks of gas, we have leaks of, which is a greenhouse gas, methane, we have leaks from coal mines. So yes, it is urgent if we do not wish to see far more frequent droughts, far more frequent heat waves, far more frequent bushfires, and far more frequent floods. It's all starting to happen already. And unless we can cut it off quickly, it will get totally out of any hope of future control. I think the school climate strikes play a really important role in drawing attention to governments that they are losing the younger generation. And so yes, I do support them. They might lose the odd day of teaching, but that's hardly going to be a major impact. And they will learn so much by participating at the grassroots in the political process, because the political process is not just voting every several years. The community needs to make an input all the time, particularly when we take into account that large polluting corporations can just walk into ministers' offices. They are so powerful. So the message has to come from the grassroots, and I'm delighted with the role of school children and more broadly bodies like the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, which has many tens of thousands of members now among young people and is making its presence felt. Because I was running research projects in renewable energy, and the coal lobby didn't like it. And what happened, this was in 1982, they managed to get CSIRO to shut down all renewable energy research across the whole organisation, across the whole country. And yet CSIRO was a world leader in solar housing, passive solar housing, solar hot water, liquid fuels, renewable liquid fuels, and our own group on wind power. We were doing wind power research before there was a large-scale industry in the world, and they just shut it down. And for over a decade, there was no renewable energy research done in CSIRO. There's a bit now, but which is great, but it's taken a while, and that's the sort of
Set us back, yeah.
I mean, power. This is about not just about electric power, but it's about political power. Yes, and it's important that researchers speak up, I think. My attitude is we've had the opportunity to do research in this area, therefore we have the responsibility to communicate